Number 1. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. A crude pentagram smeared across a bedroom wall, drawn in cheap lipstick, drawn in human blood. It was the calling card of a phantom. In 1984, this single symbol paralyzed the entire state of California. Citizens barricaded their heavy wooden doors. Gun sales skyrocketed overnight. Guard dogs sold out in a matter of days. The sweltering summer nights of Los Angeles belonged to a shadow, a drifter who turned ordinary suburban bedrooms into slaughterhouses. No motive, no pattern, just a relentless appetite for violence. Richard Ramirez was not a criminal mastermind. He was a transient drifter. A drifter fueled by heavy narcotics and an obsession with Satanism. While the city slept, he prowled the dark alleys and overgrown backyards of the sprawling metropolis. He did not stalk specific targets. He looked for opportunity, an unlocked window, a faulty screen door, a cracked garage. He targeted men. He targeted women. He targeted children and the elderly. It did not matter. The escalation was terrifyingly rapid. What began as petty burglaries morphed into an uncontrollable bloodlust. He operated completely outside the established profiles of serial predators. Law enforcement was blind. He crossed jurisdictional lines from Los Angeles to San Francisco, leaving zero predictable traces. He blended perfectly into the grimy underbelly of the 1980s urban decay, a ghost moving through the smog. He slept in cheap motels. He pawned stolen jewelry. He prepared his weapons for the next hunt. The attacks were frantic, disorganized, devastating. He struck in the dead of night. He forced his way inside. He severed phone lines. He brought heavy-caliber guns. He brought hunting knives. He brought heavy steel hammers. Husbands were executed first. A single gunshot to the head while they slept. Wives were bound, gagged, assaulted. He forced them to swear allegiance to Satan. He ransacked their homes while they bled on the carpet. He paused to eat their food. He drank their sodas in the kitchen. Then he vanished into the dark. 13 people were murdered. Over 20 were brutally assaulted and left for dead. The psychological torture was matched only by the physical ruin he left behind. The aftermath of each invasion was a scene of pure carnage. He felt no remorse. He thrived on the panic. He stole cars. He drove aimlessly across the state line. He blasted heavy metal music on the radio. He left shoe prints stamped in blood. He was careless. He grew arrogant. He dropped a stolen dental appointment card at one scene. He left a fingerprint on a stolen car mirror. That single smudge of oil and sweat broke the case wide open. The police finally had a name. The ghost had a face. His photograph was broadcast across every television station and newspaper in the country. The predator was now the prey. In late summer 1985, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles. A resident recognized him. He ran. He tried to carjack a frightened woman. The neighborhood fought back. A mob of furious citizens chased him down the street. They cornered him. They beat him with a steel pipe until police arrived. The trial was a circus. Ramirez flashed pentagrams at the news cameras. He sneered at the grieving families. The jury did not care. They convicted him on all charges. The judge sentenced Richard Ramirez to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution on death row. He died of liver failure in 2013. He traded his absolute freedom for a concrete cage and an agonizing death behind bars. Number 2. Charles Manson. He envisioned a global apocalypse, an apocalyptic race war he called Helter Skelter. Charles Manson did not see himself as a common criminal. He viewed himself as a messiah, a prophet tuning into hidden messages buried in popular rock records. He sat in the blistering heat of a secluded desert ranch, strumming a stolen guitar and quietly programming the minds of vulnerable runaway teenagers. He needed a violent spark to ignite the end of the world. He decided to strike the wealthy Hollywood elite to light that match. Manson craved fame. He wanted to be a massive rock idol. When the Los Angeles music industry rejected his crude recordings, that rejection twisted into venomous, deep-seated paranoia. He isolated his followers at an abandoned movie set outside the city limits. He systematically stripped away their personal identities. He controlled their sleep patterns. He controlled their diets. He fed them massive doses of hallucinogens. He rebuilt them into mindless weapons. The Manson family was not a typical commune of peace and love. It was a heavily armed militia, awaiting direct orders. In August 1969, the intense frustration boiled over. Manson targeted a specific residence, a mansion previously occupied by a record producer who dismissed his talent. He did not plan to go himself. He dispatched his most brainwashed disciples with a chilling, singular objective: destroy everyone inside, as gruesomely as possible. He handed them hunting knives and a .22 caliber revolver, sending them into the dark Hollywood Hills. They scaled the heavy gate at Cielo Drive. They severed the thick telephone wires. They ambushed an innocent teenager sitting in his car in the driveway. 4 quick gunshots shattered the warm night. The disciples breached the main estate. They corralled the terrified occupants into the living room. The violence erupted instantly. The violence was absolute. Actress Sharon Tate was 8 months pregnant. She pleaded frantically for the life of her unborn child. They completely ignored her. They slashed her relentlessly. They butchered the other prominent guests. They tracked one bleeding man across the sprawling front lawn. They tackled him. They executed him in the wet grass. The slaughter was entirely unprovoked. 9 innocent people were completely massacred over 2 consecutive nights of urban terror. After smearing bloody messages onto the heavy wooden doors, the killers drove back to the desert. They showed 0 remorse. They sat casually around a blazing campfire. They watched local television coverage of their own carnage. They laughed openly at the panicked news reports. Manson absorbed their fanatical loyalty. He praised their blind savagery. They hid out in the remote basin of Death Valley. They fortified their camp. They stole custom dune buggies. They prepared for a massive war they believed they just triggered. They wore the blood of their victims on their dirty clothes like twisted badges of absolute honor. The massive police manhunt stalled for several agonizing months. The real breakthrough finally came from the inside. One of the female killers, recently arrested on an unrelated auto theft charge, bragged loudly about the horrific murders to her skeptical cellmates. Detectives immediately connected the dots and raided the remote desert compound. The trial was heavily secured and chaotic. Manson repeatedly tried to manipulate the courtroom. He carved a swastika deeply into his own forehead. His brainwashed followers shaved their heads and chanted outside the downtown courthouse. The jury remained completely unswayed by the theatrical circus. Charles Manson and his core disciples were convicted of first-degree murder. Originally sentenced to the gas chamber, their harsh penalties were eventually reduced to life in prison. Manson spent over 45 years rotting inside maximum security state facilities. He finally died at age 83 in a cold, sterile hospital ward. He traded his sweeping desert freedom for a miserable, heavily guarded concrete cell. Number 3. Scott Peterson. The cold, dark water of the San Francisco Bay kept its heavy secrets for exactly 112 days. It finally surrendered them in April 2003. 2 heavily decomposed bodies washed onto the jagged, rocky shoreline. A murdered, pregnant mother, her unborn son. The grisly discovery shattered a massive, nationwide manhunt. It also shattered the meticulously crafted illusion of a perfect California marriage. Just months earlier, this same family was preparing for a quiet Christmas. But behind the suburban picket fence, a deadly domestic betrayal was already in motion. Scott Peterson played the role of the devoted husband flawlessly. He smiled for cameras. He attended holiday parties. He rubbed his wife's swelling belly. Lacey Peterson was 8 months pregnant and eagerly preparing the nursery. But Scott was entirely checked out. He was living a dangerous, double reality. He was actively romancing a woman in another city. He told his mistress his wife was already dead. He claimed this would be his very first Christmas alone. It was a terrifying glimpse into his immediate plans. The upcoming birth felt like a rapidly closing trap. Scott did not want a messy divorce. He wanted a complete erasure. He began calculating his exit. Weeks before the holiday, he covertly purchased an aluminum fishing boat. He hid it inside his warehouse. He researched ocean currents. He forged homemade concrete anchors. He manufactured his own grim aquatic graveyard while his wife wrapped presents in their living room. The execution happened on the morning of Christmas Eve, 2002. The exact method of the murder remains a dark, permanent secret. He strangled or smothered her inside their quiet home. He wrapped her heavy, lifeless body in blue plastic tarps. He loaded her into the bed of his pickup truck. He concealed her under large patio umbrellas. He drove 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina. He launched the small aluminum boat into the freezing, choppy water. He hauled the tarp over the edge. He strapped the homemade concrete weights to her limbs. He shoved his pregnant wife into the dark abyss. He watched her sink. Then, he simply drove home. The aftermath was a masterclass in psychopathic detachment. He ate cold pizza. He washed his clothes. He called his mother-in-law to casually ask if Lacey was there. When the frantic search began, Scott stood on the periphery. He showed zero emotion. He dodged the news cameras. He secretly called his mistress while attending his wife's candlelight vigil. He laughed on the phone. He claimed he was standing in Paris watching fireworks. Days later, he attempted to sell Lacey's car. He inquired about selling their house. He canceled her premium cable channels. He systematically erased her existence while volunteers scoured the state searching for her. The arrogant facade finally collapsed in the spring. A massive storm churned the bay, dislodging the heavy concrete anchors. The bodies washed ashore less than 2 miles from where Scott claimed he was fishing. Police moved in immediately. They intercepted him near the Mexican border. He had dyed his dark hair bright blonde. His car was packed with survival gear, multiple cell phones, and $15,000 in raw cash. The trial was incredibly swift and damning. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly powerful and impossible to ignore. A California jury convicted Scott Peterson of first-degree murder for his wife and second-degree murder for his unborn son. He was initially sentenced to death, later modified to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He sits today inside Mule Creek State Prison. He traded his comfortable suburban existence for a heavily fortified concrete box. Number 4. Randy Kraft. Scorecard killer. A simple yellow piece of lined paper, folded neatly, hidden deep in the trunk of a brown Toyota Celica. It looked exactly like an ordinary grocery list. A column of 61 cryptic phrases written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Angel, Marine Down, Portland Elk. But this was no errand sheet. It was a ledger of death. In May 1983, a routine California traffic stop exposed a meticulous spreadsheet of human slaughter. The crumpled paper held the agonizing final moments of over 60 young men. Randy Kraft built an immaculate camouflage. He was a highly intelligent, white-collar computer consultant working in Orange County. He wore expensive tailored suits. He maintained a stable, long-term relationship. He hosted polite dinner parties for his neighbors, but beneath the polished corporate exterior beat the heart of a savage predator. The soaring highways of Southern California provided his hunting ground. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, hitchhiking was a common coastal culture. Young Marines heading back to base, drifting teenagers looking for work. Kraft recognized the opportunity. His psychological shift was absolute. He did not snap in a fit of sudden rage. He calculated his strikes like lines of code. He stocked his vehicle with heavy sedatives and potent alcohol. He cruised the dark interstate on-ramps. He smiled warmly. He offered a free ride. He offered a cold beer. He weaponized his harmless, suburban appearance to lure young men directly into a mobile torture chamber. The trap snapped shut the moment the passenger door closed. The offered drinks were heavily laced with prescription painkillers. The victims swallowed the toxic mixture. Their muscles failed. Their vision blurred. They slumped helplessly against the car window. Kraft drove them to desolate coastal canyons. He drove them to empty industrial parks. The violence he unleashed was systematic and unimaginable. He bound their wrists with incredibly tight ligatures. He burned them with vehicle lighters. He mutilated them with surgical precision. He strangled them slowly with common shoelaces. He documented the prolonged carnage. He took Polaroid photographs of their lifeless bodies, propped up on his couch. He claimed grisly physical souvenirs. He collected their personal cigarette lighters. He kept torn pieces of their clothing. He hauled the battered remains out of his moving vehicle. He abandoned them on dark, desolate freeway shoulders. He casually discarded them in muddy ravines. The aftermath was entirely cold. He washed his hands thoroughly. He went to his corporate office the next morning. He analyzed computer data while local police analyzed bloody crime scenes. He sat quietly at his desk. He opened his briefcase. He pulled out a black pen. He added another cryptic entry to his yellow ledger. He felt completely untouchable. He treated human lives like high scores in a private, twisted game. He racked up 16 proven kills. Investigators suspect the true body count easily exceeded 60. The brutal streak ended with a simple traffic violation. In May 1983, highway patrol officers pulled Kraft over for drifting across lanes. They approached his idling vehicle. They spotted a dead Marine slumped over in the passenger seat. The Marine was partially clothed and strangled. The officers arrested Kraft on the spot. They searched the trunk. They found the yellow scorecard. They found a hidden cache of horrific photographs. The evidence was absolute and unassailable. The trial dismantled his wealthy corporate facade entirely. A California jury convicted Randy Kraft of 16 counts of first-degree murder. The judge ultimately sentenced him to death. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison. He remains on death row today. He traded his lucrative career and coastal freedom for a permanent, suffocating cage of solid steel. Number 5. William Bonin, freeway killer. The heavy steel sliding door of the custom van slammed shut. The lock clicked loudly. The trap was permanently sprung. It was the blistering summer of 1979 in Southern California. The sprawling network of interstate highways offered absolute freedom for millions. But for drifting teenagers and stranded hitchhikers, those concrete arteries became a rapid conveyor belt to the grave. A calculated predator was cruising the asphalt. He did not act alone. He operated a rolling execution chamber disguised as a harmless utility vehicle. William Bonin built a remarkably ordinary existence. He was a professional truck driver. He held steady employment. He navigated the complex freeway system with legitimate authority. He knew every blind spot. He knew every desolate off-ramp. He weaponized this professional knowledge into a highly efficient hunting strategy. His psychological makeup was fundamentally broken. He harbored a violent obsession with total domination. He did not snap over a sudden grievance. His escalation was a deliberate calibration of sadistic desire. He actively recruited a rotating crew of willing accomplices to share his brutal fantasies. They reinforced his madness. They formed a lethal pack. Bonin drove his customized van along the bustling coastal corridors. He targeted young men thumbing for rides or standing idly at busy intersections. He projected an aura of absolute safety. He offered a warm smile. He offered an air-conditioned ride. The facade was flawless. He lured them inside, without triggering a single alarm. The illusion of safety vanished the second the engine roared. Bonin and his accomplices ambushed the passengers immediately. They pinned the young men against the carpeted floorboards. They restrained their wrists. They stuffed foul rags into their mouths. The moving vehicle drowned out every frantic scream. Bonin kept his eyes locked on the road. He drove casually through heavy Los Angeles traffic. In the back, the torture commenced. They beat their captives relentlessly. They assaulted them with brutal precision. They strangled them using common t-shirts. They used heavy wire. The agonizing executions dragged on for hours, while surrounding commuters drove completely oblivious just inches away. Bonin eventually pulled over onto the dark shoulder of the interstate. He hauled the battered remains out the side doors. He dumped them in shallow drainage ditches. He tossed them over rusted guardrails like discarded trash. The aftermath was aggressively remorseless. Bonin wiped the steering wheel. He stopped at local diners to eat heavy meals with his accomplices. They laughed over greasy food. They bragged quietly about their absolute control. Bonin returned to his regular trucking routes the very next morning. He drove past the exact locations where his victims were actively decomposing. He racked up 21 confirmed kills. The staggering body count left the FBI scrambling, while Bonin simply washed his van and prepared for another hunt. The massive killing spree finally imploded in June 1980. Undercover officers caught a massive break. They spotted Bonin driving his infamous van. They trailed him closely. They watched him pick up another young hitchhiker. When the vehicle abruptly stopped in a dark alley, police swarmed. They ripped open the sliding doors. They caught Bonin actively assaulting his next target. The evidence inside the rolling slaughterhouse was completely irrefutable. The accomplices rapidly turned on him. They traded their testimonies for lighter sentences. The trial was swift and brutal. A jury convicted William Bonin of 14 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him directly to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison. In 1996, he became the first inmate in California history executed by lethal injection. He traded his boundless highway freedom for a cold gurney and a chemical needle. Number 6. Cary Stayner. A scorched red rental car sat abandoned in the dense, freezing woods of the Sierra Nevada. The charred metal reeked of gasoline and melted plastic. The destroyed trunk contained a horrific secret that instantly paralyzed the entire California tourism industry. In early 1999, the majestic wilderness of Yosemite National Park transformed into a massive, active crime scene. The towering redwood canopy concealed a brutal predator, operating in plain sight. He used the staggering beauty of the mountains as the ultimate hunting ground. Cary Stayner wore the ultimate mask of harmless authority. He was the friendly handyman working at a rustic lodge just outside the main park gates. He fixed broken heaters. He offered trail advice to visiting families. He smiled warmly at the tourists checking into their quiet cabins. But his psychological foundation was entirely shattered. Decades earlier, his younger brother was famously abducted, his family fractured. Stayner grew up in the dark shadow of that severe trauma. That deep resentment mutated into violent, obsessive fantasies regarding absolute control. He did not snap over a sudden grievance. He meticulously planned his hunting strategy. He possessed master keys to every room on the expansive property. He knew the isolated trails. He knew exactly how long it took local deputies to respond to emergencies. The wilderness offered massive, unmonitored blind spots. He weaponized his trusted uniform. He prepared his heavy hunting knives. He waited patiently for the heavy winter storms to isolate the motel. The slaughter commenced in February. He targeted a mother, her teenage daughter, and their exchange student friend staying at his lodge. He knocked on their door, claiming to check a water leak. They let him inside. He drew a heavy revolver. He bound their wrists with coarse rope. The violence was immediate and devastating. He strangled the mother. He strangled the young student. He forced the teenage daughter into his truck. He drove her deep into the freezing wilderness. He executed her near a reservoir. He hauled the bodies away. He locked two inside the trunk of their rental car and set it entirely ablaze. He severed the teenager's head and abandoned her mutilated remains in the brush. The aftermath was fiercely calculated. Stayner returned to work the next morning. He plunged toilets. He answered FBI questions without blinking. He drank coffee with the search teams. He even granted television interviews expressing his fake sympathy. 5 months later, the sheer arrogance consumed him. He struck again. He ambushed a park naturalist outside her secluded cabin. He tackled her into the dirt. He severed her head with a massive blade. He dumped her body near a mountain stream. He drove away casually. He stopped at a local bar. He drank heavily. He bragged to locals about his deep knowledge of the vast, unforgiving forest. The final murder shattered his flawless facade. Witnesses spotted Stayner's distinct vehicle leaving the naturalist's cabin just before her headless body was discovered. The FBI tracked him to a remote resort camp. They cornered him. The interrogation lasted merely hours, before his arrogant ego demanded the spotlight. He confessed to everything. He detailed the horrific mutilations with cold, clinical precision. He drew explicit maps to the missing body parts. The trial was heavily guarded and incredibly brief. The physical evidence was entirely overwhelming. A federal and state jury convicted Cary Stayner on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him directly to death. He was transported to San Quentin State Prison to await his execution. He traded the boundless freedom of the California wilderness for a heavily fortified concrete box on death row. Number 7. Juan Corona. A crumpled meat market receipt. A simple piece of torn white paper heavily stained with damp earth and dark blood. It lay buried deep in the soil of a peach orchard. In the spring of 1971, the fertile agricultural heartland of California surrendered an unimaginable harvest. 25 butchered bodies dragged from the dirt. The sheer scale of the slaughter paralyzed the nation. It was a rural massacre, completely unmatched in American history. The monster responsible was not a phantom. He was a pillar of the local community. Juan Corona was a highly respected labor contractor. He drove a pristine truck. He attended church. He supplied critical manpower to the sprawling ranches of Sutter County. He held absolute power over desperate men. Migrant workers arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They needed cash. They needed shelter. Corona offered both. But beneath his polished, authoritative exterior, a violent psychological fracture widened. He suffered from severe schizophrenia. He harbored deep, paranoid delusions about the men he hired. The escalation was swift and ruthless. He did not kill for money. He killed out of a twisted compulsion for absolute dominance. He weaponized his trusted position. He built a private roster of vulnerable targets, men with no local families, men who would not be reported missing. He transported them to the sprawling, isolated fruit orchards. He offered them work. He offered them a quiet place to sleep. Then the mask completely slipped. The executions were agonizingly intimate. He did not use firearms. He used sheer physical force. He isolated the workers in the remote groves under the cover of darkness. He ambushed them completely off guard. He wielded a heavy steel machete. He wielded a double-bladed meat cleaver. He swung the massive blades with terrifying power. He cleaved their skulls. He shattered their collarbones. He slashed their chests relentlessly. The violence was absolute and exhausting. He dragged their bleeding remains through the tall grass. He dug deep trenches between the fruit trees. He shoved the mangled bodies into the dark soil. He covered them with loose dirt. He packed the earth down firmly with his heavy boots. The aftermath was fiercely calculating. He wiped his blades clean. He washed his bloody hands in irrigation ditches. He returned to town immediately. He drank cold beer at the local tavern. He negotiated new labor contracts the very next morning. He continued to hire fresh victims while the rotting dead fertilized the orchards he managed. He kept a meticulous ledger, a small, dark ledger filled with dozens of handwritten names. He recorded their identities right next to his daily business expenses. He felt entirely untouchable. He treated human slaughter as just another standard administrative task on his massive agricultural payroll. The arrogant streak ended abruptly in May 1971. A local farmer noticed a freshly dug, shallow hole in his peach orchard. He called the police. They excavated the dirt and found a hacked corpse. They also found the blood-stained meat receipt, bearing Juan Corona's printed signature. The authorities tore the orchards apart. They unearthed 25 bodies in a staggered, rotting grid. Police raided Corona's home. They seized the bloody machete. They seized the handwritten death ledger. The trial dismantled his respected businessman facade completely. The physical evidence was incredibly overwhelming. A California jury convicted Juan Corona of 25 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 25 concurrent life terms. He was sent to Quentin State Prison. He died behind bars at the age of 85. He traded his sprawling agricultural empire for a heavily guarded concrete cell. and absolute historical infamy. Number 8. Richard Farley. He felt completely justified. He believed rejection was an unacceptable insult. He packed his heavy canvas duffel bags with nearly 1,000 rounds of ammunition. He loaded a 12-gauge shotgun. He loaded a high-powered rifle. He loaded multiple semi-automatic handguns. Richard Farley did not view himself as a stalker. He viewed himself as a deeply wronged romantic. He strapped a heavy bandolier of shells across his chest. He prepared to teach a violent, unforgettable lesson to the woman who dared to ignore him. Farley operated as a highly capable software engineer at ESL Incorporated in Northern California. He projected the image of a quiet, dependable defense contractor, but beneath the professional exterior festered a toxic, relentless obsession. He fixated entirely on a young female colleague named Laura Black. She declined his awkward advances. That simple rejection triggered a 4-year campaign of aggressive psychological warfare. He memorized her daily schedule. He relentlessly copied her desk keys. He flooded her office with disturbing letters. He parked outside her apartment building for hours in the dark. The company finally terminated his employment to protect her. A judge handed down a strict, temporary restraining order. Farley viewed the legal document not as a severe warning, but as a direct declaration of war. He purchased a massive arsenal of heavy weaponry. He rented a motorhome. He meticulously calculated a full-scale military assault on his former corporate headquarters. The execution commenced in the middle of a busy workday in February 1988. Farley drove his heavy motorhome directly into the corporate parking lot. He stepped onto the asphalt, armed, like a heavily equipped mercenary. He marched toward the main building. He did not hesitate. He blasted through the heavy glass lobby doors with his 12-gauge shotgun. The quiet office instantly transformed into an active war zone. He navigated the familiar cubicle mazes with lethal precision. He fired relentlessly into occupied desks. He executed former colleagues at point-blank range. He blasted through locked wooden doors. He hunted specifically for Laura Black. He spotted her diving for cover. He raised his rifle. He shot her directly in the shoulder. She collapsed onto the carpet. She managed to crawl away while he continued his brutal rampage. He hauled his massive arsenal up the stairwell. He secured a corner office on the second floor. He barricaded himself behind thick walls. 7 innocent people were completely massacred. 4 others lay severely wounded, bleeding out on the corporate carpeting. The aftermath was entirely cold and bizarre. He paced the bloody office suite. He demanded a sandwich. He demanded a cold soda. He negotiated casually on the phone with a specialized hostage rescue team while the shattered bodies of his former co-workers lay scattered just inches from his heavy boots. The massive police response trapped him entirely. Heavily armed tactical units locked down the entire corporate campus. Elite snipers positioned themselves on neighboring rooftops. The tense standoff dragged on for 5 agonizing hours. Farley finally realized his remaining ammunition was useless against an entire tactical army. He surrendered peacefully. He walked out of the shattered glass doors with his empty hands raised. He showed zero remorse. The trial was incredibly swift and damning. The prosecution presented his massive arsenal and his obsessive journals as absolute proof of cold premeditation. A California jury convicted Richard Farley of 7 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him directly to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison. He currently remains on death row. He traded his lucrative engineering career for a heavily fortified concrete box. Number 9. Morris Solomon Jr. Heavy glass shattered inward as the first barrage of high-velocity rounds ripped through the hotel lobby. Terrified guests dove blindly behind luggage carts. Heavy wooden reception desks splintered under the relentless, deafening gunfire. It was the height of the summer tourist season in 1977. The bustling Holiday Inn in downtown Reno, Nevada, instantly transformed into a chaotic slaughterhouse. Panic erupted. Blood stained the pristine carpets. The shooter held the high ground. He did not rush. He systematically locked down one of the most popular resorts in the city. Morris Solomon Jr. did not fit the profile of a heavily armed tactical threat. He blended seamlessly into the transient flow of casino tourists and desperate gamblers flooding the neon-lit streets. He was quiet. He was unremarkable. He secured a room overlooking the sprawling property without drawing a single second glance from the busy hotel staff. But his ordinary exterior masked a rapidly deteriorating psychological state. The internal fracture was severe and absolute. He harbored a deep, violent resentment against the general public. He meticulously planned a highly visible massacre. He hauled heavy duffel bags past oblivious families in the crowded elevators. He carried hundreds of rounds of heavy ammunition. He carried multiple high-powered firearms. He locked the heavy wooden door to his rented room. He drew the thick blackout curtains. He arranged his massive arsenal carefully across the 2 queen beds. He barricaded the entryway with heavy hotel furniture. He prepared to wage an isolated, unprovoked war. The brutal execution commenced without a single warning. Solomon smashed the heavy glass window of his elevated hotel room. He leveled his high-powered rifle at the unsuspecting crowds below. He pulled the trigger. He fired relentlessly into the parking lot. He fired into the busy pedestrian walkways. Innocent tourists collapsed onto the searing concrete. He shifted his aim. He blasted through the thin walls of neighboring rooms. He hunted terrified guests trying to flee down the carpeted corridors. The violence was deafening and completely indiscriminate. Hotel staff scattered. Sirens wailed in the distance. He tracked moving targets through his rifle scope. He unleashed wave after wave of heavy lead. 6 innocent people were completely massacred in the sudden onslaught. Dozens more lay severely wounded, bleeding profusely behind parked cars and concrete pillars. The sheer volume of gunfire pinned down the entire city block. The immediate aftermath inside the sniper nest was completely cold. He did not panic. He did not attempt to escape. He stood firmly amidst the shattered glass and scattered brass casings. He reloaded his magazines. He drank water from the hotel bathroom sink. He continued his relentless barrage until the firing pin clicked on an empty chamber. He burned through his entire massive stockpile of ammunition. He achieved his twisted objective. A massive tactical response surrounded the entire property. Heavily armed SWAT units breached the hotel. They evacuated bleeding guests down the concrete stairwells. They converged on his specific floor. They prepared for a massive, bloody firefight. But the expected shootout never materialized. Solomon exhausted his heavy ammunition supply. He unbarred his heavy hotel door. He walked out into the corridor with his empty hands raised high. He surrendered immediately to the advancing tactical officers. He offered zero resistance. He showed absolutely no remorse for the sheer carnage below. The trial was incredibly swift. The physical evidence and dozens of eyewitness accounts were completely irrefutable. A Nevada jury convicted Morris Solomon Jr. of 6 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to multiple consecutive life terms. He traded the sprawling neon freedom of Reno for a heavily fortified, maximum security concrete cage. Number 10. Lawrence Singleton. A young woman crawls up a steep, dusty embankment in the blinding California sun. Both of her forearms are gone, severed completely. She uses her actively bleeding stumps to physically drag her mangled body toward the burning asphalt. Passing drivers swerve in absolute terror at the grisly sight. It is September 1978. She was completely discarded in a heavy concrete culvert and left to bleed to death in the dirt. But she refused to die. Her miraculous survival exposed a savage predator hiding entirely in plain sight. Lawrence Singleton did not look like a dangerous monster. He looked exactly like an ordinary, balding merchant marine. He drove a faded blue van. He projected the harmless demeanor of a weary grandfather heading home after a long shift. He cruised the sprawling highways of Northern California, actively hunting for a target of opportunity. He spotted 15-year-old Mary Vincent hitchhiking near the interstate. He smiled warmly. He offered a safe ride. He offered a cold soda. He completely disarmed her natural instincts. Once the heavy passenger door slammed shut, the grandfatherly illusion vanished entirely. His psychological shift was rapid and deeply calculated. He did not snap in a fit of sudden rage. He pulled over on a desolate stretch of rural highway. He bound her tightly. He ignored her frantic pleas. He drove deep into the remote canyons. He prepared to enact a sadistic fantasy of absolute domination. He believed the vast, empty desert would swallow his crimes completely. The assault was agonizingly prolonged and incredibly brutal. He hauled her forcefully into the back of the heavy van. He assaulted her relentlessly. He beat her skull with a solid steel sledgehammer. She blacked out from the sheer physical trauma. When she finally woke up, the violence escalated to unimaginable extremes. He dragged her out into the dry dirt. He wielded a heavy steel hatchet. He swung the massive blade violently. He severed her right forearm. He swung again. He severed her left forearm. He shoved her bleeding body off a steep cliff into a concrete drainage pipe. He abandoned her in the searing heat to bleed out completely. The aftermath was entirely cold and remorseless. Singleton drove away casually. He washed the heavy bloodstains from his van. He drank cold beer. He went back to his ordinary maritime job. He felt completely untouchable. But Mary survived. She packed her own deep wounds with thick mud to stop the massive bleeding. She climbed the steep ravine. Her highly detailed memory broke the case wide open. Singleton was arrested and convicted, but the justice system failed catastrophically. He served merely 8 years before his early release. He relocated to Florida. He bought a small house. He put the grandfather mask right back on. He lured a struggling mother named Roxanne Hayes inside. He attacked her immediately. He stabbed her repeatedly until she was completely lifeless on his living room floor. The brutal murder of Roxanne Hayes sent massive shockwaves of absolute fury across the entire nation. Police stormed his Florida residence. They caught him completely covered in her fresh blood. They dragged him out in heavy steel handcuffs while angry crowds rapidly gathered outside. The legal phase was incredibly swift and uncompromising. His horrific past crimes sealed his absolute fate. The prosecution presented the bloody crime scene as undeniable proof of his permanent, predatory nature. A Florida jury quickly convicted Lawrence Singleton of first-degree murder. The judge finally handed down the ultimate punishment. He sentenced him directly to death. He was sent directly to Florida State Prison. He died of aggressive cancer on death row in 2001. He traded his violently manipulated freedom for a heavily fortified concrete box and a miserable, isolated death.